eldest son of Charles I, also named Charles, had been proclaimed King of England within 6 days of his father's execution on the 30th of January 1649. Parliament, led by military leader Oliver Cromwell, declared that the proclamation was unlawful, and Cromwell became what was in reality England's first dictator, his title Lord Protector of England, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Charles hid out, rallying supporters around him, and challenged Cromwell and his troops, only to be ingloriously defeated at the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September 1651. He escaped, so the romantic story goes, by hiding in an oak tree at Boscobel, fleeing at first to France and then straight on to Holland, where his sister Mary had married William the Prince of Orange, who was stadholder or chief magistrate of the United Republic of the Netherlands. Charles's flight to France was a unique experience, living rough and being helped by ordinary people who all risked their lives on his behalf, and the experience would have a long-lasting effect on both his persona and attitudes. The various disguises that Charles used during his escape gave him the confidence to be his own man, and his escape to France, although it only lasted 6 weeks, is a journey worthy of a movie epic. Throughout his 9 years in exile, Charles lived with his many relatives and friends in France, the United Provinces and the Spanish Netherlands, absorbing a great deal of information about how other people lived and developing a real respect for the plight of both religious and political exiles. The Dutch dominated world trade during the second half of the 17th century, operating the largest fleet of trading merchants, and the country of Holland became the wealthiest and most urbanized region of Europe. Charles spent his years of exile in Europe gaining first-hand knowledge of just how sophisticated life was lived and how far his own country and its vision lagged behind. He lived at Brussels, Bruges and Brede, witnessing firsthand the international trading connections of Antwerp and its closure as a port in 1649 due to the Treaty of Westphalia, which was signed in 1648, closing part of the Scheldt River to all non-Dutch ships. This move guaranteed the golden age of Amsterdam, which took over becoming the region's premier port, where ships of the Dutch East India Company brought in exotic goods. On the 3rd of September 1658, Cromwell died, and his son Richard, his hereditary successor, was compelled to resign the army, leaving the way for General Monk, the Duke of Albemarle, to negotiate the restoration of the king to the English throne. This took place on Charles's 30th birthday, on the 29th of May 1660, and he was crowned King of England on St George's Day 1661 by the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Juxon, who, as a prelate, had also attended his father on the scaffold. To put the event into historical perspective, he was being crowned King of England within 2 months of Louis XIV taking charge of his own affairs in France with the death of Cardinal Mazarin. During his absence abroad, Charles II found that many outrages had continued to be perpetrated in England in the name of religion. The puritanical restrictions of the government of the Commonwealth under Cromwell had also suppressed any sort of creative development, cutting deep into the heart and motivating spirit of the English people. However, the monarch was a changed man, one who would lead free-thinking men who now decided that rather than killing one another or destroying each other's means of survival, it was far better to learn to be tolerant of other people's views and eventually benefit everybody by the outcome. Charles inherited his dark good looks from his mother's Italian ancestors, the Stuart charm in abundance from his father, and a strong sexuality from his maternal grandfather, Henry of Navarre. At Whitehall, his father's favourite palace, Charles created a different kind of paradise, one dominated by the gods of pleasure. He lacked the funds to turn it into a rival for Louis at Versailles, but nevertheless he lavished money upon the old palace. His wife, Catherine of Braganza, was unable to bear children, although he fathered many by his mistresses, most of whom were recognised and later ennobled. The present Dukes of Grafton, Richmond and St Albans all derived their origin from Charles. It is not surprising that he wanted to buy sumptuous and fashionable clothes. When he had been a fugitive from the Battle of Worcester in 1651, he had been forced to wear nothing but a green coat and a pair of country breeches and a pair of country shoes that made him sore all over his feet that he could scarce stir. We can see that on his return he adorned his Frenchified person with sumptuous textiles and jewels, and we would have to say that he wore his petticoat breeches very stylishly indeed. The experiences of the royalists abroad with Charles would now also have an impact on the future evolution of art, design and style in England. Luscious, lascivious and lovely ladies, many of whom were well known to Charles, always wore pearls, the essential accessories for the loose state of undress they were generally seen disported in. Court etiquette demanded that only someone of a superior rank could receive a person of lower rank when in a state of undress. By way of contrast, a person of inferior rank had to be fully and formally attired when attending a person of superior rank. Wearing undress then in a portrait underlined the fact that the sitter belonged to a very exclusive group of superior people. However, there was a downside. The format was so successful and pervasive that within 30 years everyone, irrespective of rank, was depicted in a similar way, so that those in the upper echelon of society were forced to change their style. Barbara Villiers was a luscious lady and a favourite subject for artist Sir Peter Lely, who painted her often. He used to say, "It was beyond the compass of art to give this lady her due, as to her sweetness and exquisite beauty." Barbara taught court ladies how to look suitably languishing, and she bore Charles 6 children and was created Duchess of Cleveland in 1670. Barbara was usurped by the woman who was to become Charles II's favourite mistress, Louise de Querouaille, the Duchess of Portsmouth. Charles was so besotted with her that he had her rooms rebuilt and redecorated 3 times to satisfy her expensive pleasures. It was recorded that her rooms were filled with Japan cabinets, pendule clocks, and massive silver vases beneath walls hung with some of His Majesty's best paintings. The Earl of Rochester summed up Charles's reputation in a memorable way. "Restless he rolls about from hall to hall, a merry monarch, scandalous and poor." Charles encouraged French imports and the manufacture of goods by the English, following French lines. He provided energetic, enterprising and determined men with better opportunities for growing rich than ever before, and commerce began to thrive. However, the downside of all his policies was that the cost of living rose enormously and the labouring classes' living standards declined, with the social divisions between the working population and their ruling class growing wider than ever before. Gone was the medieval lord, who would rule by personal contact with those who supported him. Charles was now just a member of a class who increasingly came together in support of one another. There's a very fine portrait of Charles in which he is being presented with a pineapple by the hands of John Rose, who was his chief gardener. The painting is much disputed in subject content, although reputed to be a vivid likeness of the king at a late period in his life, and a rare depiction of him in day dress. Following the calamitous plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666, in which Charles fought the flames, showing great personal bravery, the mathematician Christopher Wren was nominated along with architects Hugh May and Roger Pratt to rebuild London. This heaven-sent opportunity allowed Christopher Wren to present his famous plan to rebuild the city along the grandiose classical lines he had admired at Paris, with straight, broad streets radiating from piazzas, as in Sixtus V's Rome. But it was rejected as being far too radical. However, it was partly as a result of his scheme that he was appointed Surveyor General to the King's Works in 1669, and during the next 16 years designed 52 new city churches, the most famous of which was St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's Cathedral demonstrated a standard of workmanship which, once attained, remained the pride of English building for a century. The dome was inspired by one built by Bramante at Rome, and was similar to Brunelleschi's dome at Florence. Like the latter, it was to become for many a symbol of London itself, and its interior is based on many Roman role models. The pressure of Wren's public duties would exclude him from taking commissions for country or town houses. However, there is nevertheless evidence of his thoughts on the subject, and a lot of designs for unnamed houses probably in his hand in a collection at All Souls Church at London. From 1660 to 1730, London was the only real city in England. It totally dominated English urban culture, and some say even invented it so much that the greatest compliment that could be paid to a provincial town was to be called Little London. It was the seat of government, the main residence of the court, the only banking and publishing centre, and the home of the majority of professional people who occupied an intermediate position between the upper and middling parts of mankind. Bishops, most barristers and physicians, were by now members of the upper class, priding themselves on their education and birth, clinging valiantly to labels such as Esquire and Gentleman, the latter being entitled to bear arms, a deeply embedded attitude that would travel across the sea with those who went to America and be bound into its Declaration of Independence. Urban gentlemen lived off the rents of country estates, and 91% of London gentry at this time were younger sons of country gentry. When the laws of primogenitura had been universally accepted amongst the landed gentry, some means of supporting the spare heir and any other sons had to be found. The obvious was to provide them with an education and an inheritance sufficient to enable them to make their own way in the world, either in some profession or in trade. The best place to do this was in London, and an impenetrable web of relationships was woven between the middling people of London and country gentlemen. By the end of the 17th century, most of the second sons of the country gentry were in trade, and any other third sons or more had gone into the church, the latter having a negative impact on the development of theology during the 18th and early 19th centuries in England, as so many of them had no faith or religion at all. During the last 40 years of the 17th century, England was still a pre-industrial society in which most capital was engaged in agriculture, commerce and distribution. Work was still on a small scale, and few capitalists employed more than half a dozen people, a fact which makes it difficult to define the break-off point between middle and working classes at this time. Indeed, the majority of people belonged to the working classes and were farmers and artisans, as well as petty capitalists. They owned their own tools, used their own money to buy raw materials, seed and stock, and hoped to make a profit by their labour, which they added to their small amount of capital. What lifted some out of this system to the next corporate level was the fact that their activities not only fed and clothed them, but also enabled them to accumulate some funds on a regular basis, seeking to improve themselves and their quality of life, and this became an essential feature of the middling sort of people. A new class, the landed gentry, also emerged, having come from the merchant or growing professional classes. They shared roughly the same ideals as their so-called aristocratic superiors, and to cover their favour, backed up their ideas and ideals. Grand people still travelled about the countryside, but country houses now remained furnished. They were also gradually expanded to provide suitable accommodation needed for visitors, who often stayed for long periods because the journey and roads to and from the town were absolutely appalling. They did not just knock down the old houses, but instead renovated or redecorated the original with more fashionable items. Establishing a permanent house in town became necessary with the expansion of commerce, one which would not require any more space than the company needed to fill it for an occasion. Architect Sir Roger Pratt designed and supervised the building of Clarendon House on Piccadilly in 1664 at London. Pratt had spent 6 years studying architecture in France, Italy and Flanders, which is seen as particularly significant to the evolution of domestic buildings in England. This single project has since been pinpointed as one of the most important buildings in English architectural history by academics such as the esteemed Sir John Summerson, who recorded that houses after this design, both large and small, well and ill, were built throughout Britain. Roger Pratt worked for the Lord Chancellor Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon, under whose leadership the country had enjoyed relatively sound and stable government. Lord Clarendon used stone recycled from the medieval Cathedral of St Paul's, which had been destroyed in the Great Fire in 1666. To build Clarendon House, 300 men were employed and an expenditure of over £50,000 made. It had glittering tall windows, was built on an H layout plan, 3 stories high with a raised piano nobile or noble first floor, over a service basement with a large courtyard in the front of it. An unsuccessful war with Holland between 1665-7 led to Clarendon's downfall and the demolition of Clarendon House by 1684, but not before it had had a major impact on the future of housing development. The architect Hugh May, 1622-1684, had also been in exile in Holland with Charles II. His importance is in having designed and built a handful of houses which prove the usefulness of the Dutch style in a country where brick was now the principal building material. The use of red brick trimmed with white stone was a version of classicism that was visually agreeable, easy and economical to build, and it became the rage of the second half of the 17th century in England. Burlington House in Piccadilly flanked Clarendon House, and Sir John Denham, poet and amateur architect, began building it in 1665. He managed to have himself appointed surveyor of the King's Works in 1660, and in 1667 the house was sold unfinished to Richard Boyle, the 1st Earl of Burlington. He called for Hugh May to complete the task, and took up residence in April 1668, when he recorded in his diary that the total cost of the house had been some £5,000. Burlington House was what is now known as a typical restoration house, built of good red brick dressed simply with stone and wood, with a hipped roof, 2 rooms thick and projecting wings to the front. Before it lay a courtyard, flanked by pavilions containing the stables and kitchens, with at the back large formal gardens and walled kitchen gardens. During Charles's reign, the formal garden, where the aim is to subdue nature by art, was brought to an apotheosis in England. John Evelyn, 1620 to 1706, was a well-known diarist and author who acquainted English readers with Italian and French contemporary garden design philosophy, influencing the taste of a nation. He recorded that fashionable house parties would sometimes go to watch a river being made more navigable or a fen being drained, because at this time most of the countryside of England was still relatively wild. He also recorded an after-dinner walk with the Duke of Lauderdale in August 1678. The house and garden is indeed inferior to few of the best villas in Italy itself. The parterres, the gardens, the orangeries, the groves, the avenues, the courts, the statues, the perspectives, the fountains, the aviaries, and all this at the banks of the sweetest river in the world must needs be surprising. Neither a sage nor a hero, John Evelyn dealt with a multitude of subjects. His knowledge of every aspect of forestry and arboriculture included the use of trees both in existing gardens and in garden design projects. He encouraged intensive tree planting, primarily oak, intended at providing supplies of timber for the British Navy following deprivations of the forests and parks under the rule of Cromwell and the Commonwealth. Evelyn is attributed with introducing the word avenue into the English language. At the old Tudor palace of Hampton Court, Charles II established gardens with radiating linden or lime trees imported from Holland. In 1662, John Evelyn visited Hampton Court and admired the sweet rows of lime trees and the canal water, now nearly perfected. The yew tree is associated with wisdom. Many of them still standing in England have been there for over 1,000 years, and it is one of the oldest living inhabitants of Europe. John Evelyn encouraged the use of yew trees for woods, hedging and for clipping into topiary shapes in the garden. Its colour has been deliciously described as the colour of ancient widows' shawls, and as unkempt and wispy as their hair. It provides a perfect foil for most colours in the garden, and spring it has a coppery bloom. Like the hornbeam, it only requires clipping once a year. Charles II initiated the fashionable promenade, relocating this social necessity in what now has become known as the Park. In 1661, he opened St James's Park, and this is when, for the first time, the term park was used. It became the park for the next 100 years or more, and a new denomination of time came into being: park time. In ensuring that the park became a place of leisure and pleasure, Charles II established a role model for public parks for the future, for that of retreat, recreation and refreshment. The natural progression from the city promenade would be town walks, and within a decade few self-respecting towns all over England was without one. It was now a case of rus in urbe, or bringing the country to the city. Luxurious textiles played an increasingly important part in 17th century decorative schemes. Tapestry was considered especially suitable for hangings on walls and beds. In England, Charles II's father had encouraged the establishment of the Mortlake Works and the brilliant abilities of its designer Francis Klein. Tapestry has often been called the mirror of civilization because so many represented scenes of everyday life, including a great historical exploit or incident in the life of the lord of the house, and they were draped over furniture and used in upholstery. Grinling Gibbons became the most famous of all workers in wood. Born in Holland, Gibbons came to England in 1667, and his amazing career began on the 18th of January 1671 when the diarist John Evelyn discovered him sitting outside a thatched house in a field near Deptford while he was riding by, carving a copy of Tintoretto's Crucifixion. Within a few weeks, Gibbons had been introduced to Charles II and had received commissions for Windsor Castle and other royal palaces, as well as St Paul's colleges at Oxford and Cambridge. The virtuosity of his remaining works, rendered almost in 3D, remain today completely breathtaking. The 18th century diarist Horace Walpole was to say of Gibbons, "There is no instance of a man before Gibbons who gave wood the loose and airy lightness of flowers, and chained together the various productions of the elements with the free disorder natural to each species." Gibbons was employed by Christopher Wren to work on the choir stalls and organ case at St Paul's Cathedral, and he also decorated with fine limewood drapery the reredos, or screen behind the altar, at one of Wren's churches in St James's. It displays the virtuosity of his works in wood. At Petworth House in West Sussex in the gallery, his intricate wood carvings outline portraits of history's most famous celebrities. Charles II had encouraged artists like Gibbons to come to England to inspire young tradesmen, as so many men who would have been their masters and mentors had perished during the wars of the Commonwealth. So successfully did Gibbons revive local woodworkers' skills that by early in the 17th century they were achieving new heights of technical skill, reflected in the work of Edmund Pearce, who used pine, ash and oak to carve a staircase between 1704 to 22 at Cassiope Park at Watford. Up until now, the aristocracy had used glasses from Venice, the English not having the necessary skills to produce such exquisite work. The Republic of Venice still kept their glassmakers prisoners on endeavouring to maintain their domination on a market they had had for over 300 years. However, the world was changing and a few escaped, and other countries obtained the secret of glass manufacture. Following enormous experimentation and under a patent granted by Charles II, George Ravenscroft's experiments led to a new type of glass, one which contained lead. It earned him a Certificate of Merit in June 1676 from the glass sellers because it was whiter in colour with greater refractive properties than Venetian cristallo, and by 1690 lead glass was being widely used in Britain. Because lead glass was slow to cool, glassmakers were able to manipulate it into exactly the robust, simple shapes that appeal so strongly to the prevailing English taste. In a letter of the 3rd of May 1671 to Alessio Morelli, his supplier at Venice, London glass seller John Green says, "Sir, I pray you once again to take such care that I may have good and be used very kindly in the price. Else it will not be in my interest to send to Venice for neither drinking glasses nor looking glasses, for we make now very good drinking glasses in England and better looking glasses than any that comes from Venice." During his 25 years on the English throne, Charles II had prided himself on his wit and his worldliness. He encouraged literary pursuits in poetry and prose, even when much of it lampooned his personality and sense of drama. It was an unusual historical period in that his presence and personality permeated literary society to such an extent that, almost uniquely, Restoration literature, prose, poetry, and plays reflect the court, covering the duration of the effect of Charles, his manner and personal style, an effect that would extend far beyond his death. With the restoration of Charles II to the throne of England in 1660, England had regained its smile. Charles restored an enjoyment of life, and with it a hope for the future. On the 2nd of February, in the year that Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes, 1685, Charles II suffered a fit. After lingering for 4 days, he asked that his brother James, who was to succeed him, look after his mistresses, apologising to everyone present for taking so long to die. He converted to Roman Catholicism, and following his death 4 days later, was buried in Westminster Abbey. From 1685, a flood of Huguenot immigrants began arriving at London, introducing new ideas, new techniques and skills, which would, within a few years, have a great impact on the development of the arts and help to increase the economy. While the so-called Merry Monarch may have been condemned for the looseness of his morals, it would have to be said that no English sovereign was more tolerant of critical writers with opposing philosophies, or did more to foster the imagination, the innovation and creativity of their age.